My name is Roy Wade. I am a Commonwealth Fund Harvard Minority Health Policy Fellow. I'm a pediatrician, recently from Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm interested in child maltreatment and child abuse prevention strategies, and I'm happy to be here to introduce our speaker. Our speaker today, as you all know, is Professor David Gergen. Professor Gergen is a senior policy analyst at CNN and has been advisor for 4 U.S. presidents. He is a professor of public service and director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. In 2000, he published the book Eyewitness to Power, The Essentials of Leadership, Nixon to Clinton. Professor Gergen got his start in public life as a speechwriter in the Nixon White House. He went on to serve in the Department of Communications for Gerald Ford and as Director of Communications for Ronald Reagan, and as advisor to Bill Clinton in the 1980 George H.W. Bush presidential campaign. In 1985, he got his start in journalism serving as editor-in-chief for U.S. News and World Report and contributing to political discussions for the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. Today, he is seen frequently on CNN as a political analyst, and he has up to 19. He has held 19 honorary degrees and sits on numerous boards, including Teach for America, the Aspen Institute, and Duke University. He graduated with honors from Yale and Harvard Law School, and served in the U.S. Navy as an officer from 1967 to 1971. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Gergen.
The White House is actually a very small place. When one walks in, I think almost everyone is taken by surprise just how sort of tiny everything is, and how many people are crammed into the West Wing. This has been particularly true during the Obama administration, when it's just thick with people. You know, a couple of people could be in the same office, or 4 or 5 people in an outer office, and people, and it's frenetic in many ways, because the Obama administration inherited so many urgent problems, and then it had ambitions of its own. So it has been an unusual administration in that sense, and everything is sort of moves at a very, very high pace. And these are burnout jobs for many people. They, especially at the staff level, people tend to last maybe for a couple of years. But then the stress, the toll on families and personal life can be pretty intense. And so there are a number of people who tend to leave after 2 years. Also, you are working so hard you don't have time to read and refresh, and so you're living off to a considerable extent the intellectual capital you bring to the job. It's a rare job. I mean, you learn a lot of things around you, but it's not as if you can go into the literature. So it's really, really helpful if you're coming into one of these high-powered agencies. What you bring with you is, and the preparation you do while you're in school, while you're in your profession, makes a big, big difference, because there's this idea that one can sort of learn as you go because you can look everything up on the internet. It doesn't work out so well here. A lot depends on the intellectual capital and understandings and relationships that you bring, because you just simply don't have time. Given the demands of the job, people getting in really early, leave late, then there's social engagements. There are just a whole lot of things that come with it. But from the president's point of view, and decision-making in the White House is very idiosyncratic. It depends a great deal on the personality of the individual who's president, and how that person learns, for example, is very, very important. Peter Drucker, who was a management guru, he was for many in the business community. He's a critical player, but he's no longer alive. But if there's a famous essay from Peter Drucker about managing oneself, not just learning to manage others, but learning to manage yourself. And one of the major arguments he makes is about how people learn. And learning how you learn is important, but it's also important to know how your superior learns, and in particular, if it's a president, how that person learns. Some people are readers, and they learn best by having fairly dense material. Jimmy Carter was famous for wanting to read a fair amount, and his staff tended to overload him. They sent him home early in his presidency with as many as 400 pages of reading a night. Even if you're a graduate student who's preparing for your doctoral degree, that's a lot of reading to do, especially if it's dense. Richard Nixon liked to read, and he learned through the reading, whereas others, Lyndon Johnson famously needed it orally, and it was a lot about oral briefings. Bill Clinton learned both ways. He was a famous extrovert who liked to talk late at night to lots and lots of people by phone. But he also was a reader. Reagan tended to be much more verbal and liked everything short. He liked everything on one page. He operated to a considerable degree by intuition. George W. Bush tended to operate even more by intuition and uninformed intuition frequently, because he wasn't by nature. He didn't have the character flaws of some of our presidents, and character flaws have often brought people down. But he was, he wasn't a curious person by nature. It became more so when he became president. So you do find that how the system works matters a lot. It depends a lot on the individual, how they learn, and how many people they want in the room when they make decisions. Some people, like Bill Clinton, love to have a table full of people and people on the outskirts of a table on the walls, contributing to a conversation. He sort of liked to glean as much information as he could from a lot of people. Others like a very tight decision circle. They feel that the leak problem, somebody leaking something out of the meeting, they go crazy on. Barack Obama is a very, very disciplined person. He's more of an introvert than an extrovert. He likes to read, and he likes to take his homework home with him at night. And whereas he doesn't mind having a conversation about a decision with a large group of people, he tends to make decisions in a small circle. And if anything, I think one of the lessons he learned about the first 2 years in office is that he was operating in too small a circle. That he was. I've actually had a conversation with him about this. It's off the record, and it was we had a one-on-one after sometime before Christmas for about 40 minutes to talk about his presidency, and it was clear that he feels that one of the things they need to change was that there was too much of a bubble in the White House, and that often happens. It's a danger in any organization that you draw into the people you mostly trust, and if you're not careful, you can get into groupthink. A famous phrase from a fellow named Irving Janis, who went back and looked at the Vietnam War, as a prime example of people being trapped in their own thinking of a small circle and not enough dissident voices. And I think that so the decision-making process then depends a lot on just the surrounds and the idiosyncrasies. And then, of course, there are all the stakeholders that in the healthcare field in particular, as Bob will tell you more, he knows better than I do, there are just so many different stakeholders in healthcare that the process of putting together a decision requires a lot of work beyond the president himself by his team, who has to spend a lot of time talking to and taking it into account, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry or the docs or as providers, or the people who are concerned about the elderly and the AARP. There are just so many other people that you have to, and members of Congress. And one of the things that happened to the Obama administration and the decision making on health care was that they had very heavily relied on Tom Daschle. In the run-up to becoming president, Tom Daschle spent an awful lot of time as sort of the heir apparent to be the healthcare czar, in effect. He had spent an awful lot of time talking to all the stakeholders on his own before Obama became president. He was, in effect, anointed to do that. And he had, I think, made a lot of progress and sort of lining up the stars, in effect, so that and that in effect the president could make a series of decisions, they could get agreement, and in effect have maybe a coalition that would help to pull healthcare through, because it has been so difficult for so many presidents. And when he went down in the confirmation process over, frankly, a fairly piddling thing, but it took him down, it really set them back in terms of decision making, and the process became much more complex, and it really, I think, increased the pressure to cede a lot of the authority for writing the health care bill to members of Congress. And so a lot of, and just as they had done with the stimulus package, and then the health care bill came along behind that, an awful lot of authority was ceded from the executive branch to Congress to write, and the White House was in communication with, was continually talking to members of Congress about what they were doing. But the decision-making itself, the center of gravity for a lot of decision-making actually left the White House, I think. And the president sort of blessed things as they went and gave his guidance. But, he did leave a lot to them. So it was an unusual blend of decision-making. And what it did was it raised the likelihood of the bill passing. I think they got it passed, in effect, because they ceded as much authority, but it made it a less coherent bill, and it made it and it had so many different pieces to it that it became an extraordinarily complex product. And in the process of getting it done, depending on where you sit, I mean, a lot of people think it's a very sound approach. Others think it's a disaster. But where you sit on it and where you stand on it, I think whatever you think about it, it is also true that they lost the message war in the process of getting the bill, because it came out of such a complex decision-making process, an unusual decision-making process. They were not able to deal with the opposition as effectively as they might, and left a bill that was highly controversial, and of course and because there was so much Republican resistance to so many elements of it, was passed in a highly partisan way, and now remains political football. And I think that's extremely unfortunate outcome. Typically, a more coherent decision-making process, perhaps, there's no guarantees in this, could have yielded a bill that was less controversial and more bipartisan. And I think it was a great tragedy for the country that what emerged was not more bipartisan, because it's left it as a political football, and nobody knows for sure what's going to happen, how much it will be funded, how much it won't be funded. It won't be funded. Mike Bloomberg is out saying today it's not going to be funded, and quite worried about that. And frankly, it's left a lot of the stakeholders, especially corporations, not knowing what their bills are going to be, or not knowing how to plan the future, because they don't know what's going to be happening on healthcare. And the HR officers for a lot of major corporations are quite concerned because of the degree of uncertainty that now surrounds all of it. It would be far better for everybody if this was settled one way or the other on several aspects of the bill. So that's a long-winded response, but maybe you can focus in on what really matters here.
Why don't we open it up, and then I'll go back. So questions, why don't you just tell David who you are and pursue this as long as it's presidents and decision making. Come on, most people don't have a shot here.
Please.
Sure.
My name is Thomas Cujo. I'm a PhD candidate in health policy and management.
Where are you from?
I'm from Macon, Georgia originally.
Macon, Georgia. All right.
I was just wondering, what early critical decisions did you make that set you up to be in the position that you are now? We're all early in our career, so what decisions did you make that enabled you to do the things that you've done?
Well, I went to law school here at Harvard. And when I came out, for a variety of reasons, did not really pursue the practice of law. I went straight in the military coming out of, it was during the Vietnam period. I'm about before you were born. And I went in the Navy for 3.5 years. And when I came back out, just by pure happenstance, it wasn't purely happenstance. One of the things you find here at this university is that you get to know a lot of people who go on to do interesting things. And that networking, which is like intense at the business school, and one of the reasons people go to the business school is because of the networking. And some people can spend way too much time on it. But as it happened, a very dear friend of mine who I went to college with and was at the law school was working in the White House and working in the West Wing. And while I was in the Navy, he called me after I was overseas for a couple of years. And he called me and asked me if I'd come back and join a task force to reform the draft, which we had as a compulsory service system, and it was the draft was a very screwed up organization at that time. It was supposed to be and by the way, do we have time for humor or anecdotes or anything
yes.
like that here? Okay. Good. I'm glad to have a sense of humor at the School of Public Health. I was a young officer. 7 or 8 of us came in as young officers to reform the draft. And one of our first assignments, and I learned a lot from this year. I was in uniform at the time. Most people thought I was, sold tickets to movie houses, but as I walked around Washington in my uniform. The president, it was President Nixon at that time, had ordered. There was a compulsory draft, and you had to sign up at the age of 18. And he had ordered a random lottery as a way of selecting people who were going to go. The idea was if you got a low number, you were going to be the first to be drafted. And if you got a very high number, that meant you weren't going to be drafted. So if you got a low number, and Vietnam War was raging, there was a good chance you were going to go to Vietnam. It's a fair chance you might get killed. I mean, it was not an insubstantial risk. It mattered a hell of a lot what number you had. And so he decided he wanted to have a random lottery. And at that time, they had a fellow who was sort of the J. Edgar Hoover of the draft, named Lou Hershey, was running the draft system. He was been around a long time, and when he was told to have a random lottery, he said, "Well, we'll do it the way we did it in World War II, which was a very popular war, and we'll get capsules, and we'll put January 1 in the first capsule, January 2 in the second capsule, put days of January, put the capsules into a vat, then we'll put February on top of that, March, April, May, up until December. Then we'll take a spoon, stir up the capsules, put them in a closet. The day of the lottery, we'll pull them out, reach in. The first capsule we pull out is going to have number 1, and then number 2, number 3, etc. Draft number 1. Well, when they did that, guess what? Somebody was born on like December 15th was number 1. Somebody born on December 8th was number 2. November was number 3. And so forth. And if you were born in January, you got a very high number. So that caused one hell of a row. And a group of graduate students out of the University of Michigan did a analytical statistical study of it and said, this ain't random. And they sued. And so we had a court case, and then there was one thing else. So they then fired they allowed the director of selective service to retire. And they asked this young group of officers to come in and work with a new director. He came out of the corporate world. And so our first assignment was figure out how to, this is my first assignment in government, and a semi-civilian deal, was figure out how to run a random lottery. So our little band of officers consulted a lot of people. We found the leading statistician in the country was a fellow named Tukey, who was on the Princeton faculty. And he said, look, the way to do this is to get a computer and randomly generate the days of the year and then fill the capsules in that order and then put them in the vat and draw them out and so forth and so on. My contribution to this was to say, I think some people still think it's fixed when Senator X has a son who gets 360. Why don't we have 2 vats and use the Tukey solution for generating the days of the year in one vat, and then have another bowl that's going to be numbers 1 through 365, all randomly generated and filled in the bowl. But have 2 bowls, put them in a closet, bring them out, stir them up, and have 2, and then reach into each of the bowls. You get the day here and the number here, and that's the cross. Nobody can fix that. Everybody said fine. And so I said, the second thing I want, the day we do this, we're going to have a lot of press there. I want 2 extremely innocent-looking young blondes, good looking, in short skirts, to come out and do the drawings. Because I want them really innocent looking. These were the first Vanna Whites. You know, I don't know if you saw it. And sure enough, we had these young blondes come out there and do this. Everybody thought it's pure as American-driven snow. What the heck? You know, how could these girls will never fix this? We had these two vats. Boom. That problem was solved. And so it became apparent to me that government has a lot to do with substance and getting it right. It has a lot to do with the gloss you put on it and the way you present it. I mean, there's a lot of little showbiz here, too. You should not forget the showbiz as a way of getting the public's attention. In any event, that led to a variety of different assignments. And when I was coming out of the Navy, I got a call from this friend of mine who had helped to bring me back to say, there's a job over here in the White House, working with a guy who just become head of the speechwriting team, and he's looking for an assistant. Would you be interested? And I said, well, listen, I voted for Hubert Humphrey. I didn't vote for Richard Nixon. And he said, that's all right. Well, you know, why don't you come over and talk to him? So I went and talked to him, and there were several contenders for this job, including a fellow who was marrying the president's daughter. So I thought, well, that's never going to happen. And I was going to go back to North Carolina, where I'm from, and I had a job at the University of North Carolina. In any event, they called me out of the blue when I was interviewing in North Carolina and said, the guy who was looking for somebody to work for him, he said, you know, even though you voted against Nixon or for Humphrey, we had hit it off really well. We had extremely good conversations. He said, we actually need some dissenting voices in here. We need somebody with alternative perspectives. Why don't you think about coming in for a year? You give it a trial for a year, and I'll give it a trial for a year. And I said, sure, that sounds like a great adventure. Which was what I did. And so it was partly by happenstance, but partly because of the networking. He went back to Harvard, and partly because you've got to connect at some human level with the people you're working with in politics. You can't. It's not just a question of what's on your resume. It's also the chemistry that matters, and whether there's a trust factor or not. And that I went in for a year, and I stayed for 3.5. And I was there. The fellow who ran the speechwriting team, it was a team of around 50 people who were we had both writers and researchers, and there were some interesting people. A fellow named Bill Sapphire was on that team. A fellow named Pat Buchanan was on that team. I hired a fellow named Ben Stein. I don't know how many of you have ever seen win Ben Stein's money. It was somebody I hired. We had John McLaughlin, who had this TV political show. We hired. We had we had some interesting personalities. There were some people a little crazy, but speech writing is an avenue in for young people who haven't. If you want to study a substantive issue like healthcare, it probably takes you 10 years in the field to be accepted into the circles of those who are in a major conversation. If you're a speechwriter, you get a special pass to come and sit on the sidelines and be witness, but you become involved even though you don't know what the hell you're talking about at a pretty young age. And it's a good thing to do when you're early, not a good thing to do when you're late. But it's a pass into the corridors of power, and I found it fascinating. I was going to Nixon cabinet meetings, at the age of 27, 28 years old, taking notes for our team. And when my boss decided after a year and a half to become sort of a counselor type, I actually took over the speechwriting team, and so I was in charge of about 50 people there, and it was a very, very tough experience because we went through Watergate. I was there through Watergate, and it was it was very, very rough because you didn't know who was telling the truth. When the day that I remember driving into work one morning and parking on the West Executive Avenue. and I saw everybody was scurrying around, and I said, "What's going on?" And a fellow who knew a lot about it said, "Well, why don't you just? It's going to be an interesting day." And about 10 o'clock in the morning, I got a call in saying, Alex Butterfield, who was one of the president's top aides, is testifying this afternoon in front of Congress at 2 o'clock, and we're all going to gather and watch it on TV down in Ken Clausen's office. Why don't you join us? I said, fine. I don't know why they wanted to get together, but fine. I knew that something was happening. So I go in about 2 o'clock, and there are 20 people in this room getting ready to watch this thing, and there's an open bar. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I said, why have we got an open bar in here? So they just said, wait. And a number of people got drinks. And then it was in that afternoon that Alex Butterfield testified that there was a taping system, that Nixon had a taping system in the White House. And his conversations had been taped. Now, there were a number of us in that room who were ecstatic because we thought, aha, we've never been able to prove he was innocent. Now we will have the proof that he was innocent. Now, I noticed that all the people who thought he was innocent went to places like Harvard. We all came from fairly elite schools, and we were naive as all hell. And all the people who'd come up on the rough side of life, who came up on the wrong side of the tracks, and who'd seen a lot of life, they all got drunk. And they all said, it's over. It's over because the tapes are going to convict him. They thought all along he was guilty, and now there was going to be proof that he was guilty. And it turned out that those of us who went to Harvard got it wrong. That the cynics were right, but it was such an interesting insight for me into what happened, and it was one of the hardest questions you can face, and if you're in government, is if you're working for somebody who's crooked, or if you're working for somebody who's unethical. What do you do? And what if you were suspicious but you don't have the proof? And it was hard to know. Should you leave? And I had people on my team who left. I felt I couldn't leave because if I left, I was at a high enough profile position, and if I left in the middle of Watergate, it would be like a statement that I didn't believe in Nixon. I thought he was guilty, but I wasn't sure. We kept on being told inside, he's not guilty, he's not guilty. This has all been made up by the press, and I was in charge of a number of sideline investigations of other things that he was being accused of that proved not to be valid or meritorious. But on the central charge, central charges of whether he, in effect, ordered a cover-up of Watergate break-in, we weren't sure, and it was I didn't know until right at the end. The cover-up worked really well inside the White House. It worked better there than anywhere else, and it was a shock to me that how much of a betrayal there had been. And he needed to resign. It was important. The scandal was such he had to resign. He was the author of his own demise. But as that happened, those of us who were working for him felt, this is it for us. Our careers are over. It's like playing for the Chicago Black Sox. The Chicago Black Sox were the team that threw the World Series and on betting. And they never came back in baseball. If you saw Field of Dreams, that film, the Kevin Costner film, and they build this baseball stadium. There are people that come out of the bushes out in the outfield. Those are the Chicago Black Sox, the ghosts of the Chicago Black Sox. And we all felt we were done. And American public life tends to be more forgiving than you expect. There were a lot of people who came out of the Nixon years who, as long as you weren't directly involved in scandal, a lot of people came out and worked and went up in other administrations. And became significant cabinet players and others. That was it was a much more. It's a much more. F. Scott Fitzgerald said that, wrote that there are no second chances in American life, and it turns out that's not true. That you can go down, and you can. It's a more forgiving society if you deal with it in a proper way. I learned a lot of lessons out of all of that, but that was my first exposure to government, to power in a major sense. I'd been involved at the state level before, and I was from North Carolina. I was very involved in the civil rights movement in the '60s, and but this was my first exposure to sort of the mega decision making. But it was again, you learn an awful lot about managing up. I think it's extremely important early on in your life that you get into if you're interested in leadership, get into the arena early. Don't wait too long. Try to take some responsibility early. You'll find you'll make a lot of mistakes early, but get the mistakes out of the way. When you're young, before you have a lot of responsibility, because when you get older and you have more responsibility, you don't want to be making sort of rookie mistakes. And everybody makes mistakes. Everybody sort of doesn't. It's a learning process to know how to make things work inside a large, complex organization. And you also learn how to manage up, which is extraordinarily important, and you begin to learn how to manage down. And as you get older, you have to do a lot more managing down and mentoring and that sort of thing. But in the beginning, you've got to learn how to sort of make a system work. And it's sort of leading and managing up is not the same thing. It's harder in some ways, but if you do it right, you can become more than simply a flatterer and more than sort of simply a courtier. You can actually be constructive if you get to a place where people trust you to speak your own voice. And speaking truth to power, speaking conscience to power, you've got to have a lot of self-confidence to do that.
David?
Hi, I'm Ellen Connors, and I'm a postdoc.
Hello there, Ellen. Good to see you again.
Former student of yours.
I can remember.
Very nice to see you here. I'm interested, I know you, with your experience with the Nixon White House, as you know, President Nixon, a Republican, was proposing health care for all Americans at the time he was in office. And that effort did not succeed, and then you were with the Clinton White House when they were working on health care, and the Obama administration has finally achieved that goal. I wonder if you could explain a little bit how the Republican Party and conservatives have changed so that they would not support health care in the last two rounds, even though at the time that was an issue they cared about.
Yeah, it's the Blumenthal book, I think, is really first class on the whole history of health care. And he's now, of course, gone into the administration from here. Co-wrote it with this fellow from Brown, whose name I can't remember.
Jim Marone.
Yeah, who's good.
Yes.
It's a very nice. Do you like the book?
Yes, it's used in our class.
Good.
I didn't see those head shaking.
I learned a lot from it, and seven presidents, I think, had tried health care before Obama. Tried to have a national health care plan. Nixon was the only Republican, I believe, in that group. Although Ford made some, gave some nod of the head to it, but really Nixon tried. And the Nixon plan actually is it was much more liberal than anybody in the Republican Party would support. They had employer mandates in it, for example. That's just not supported. A couple things have happened. One is when Nixon in effect was the last liberal president, certainly of that era, and he embraced a lot of domestic proposals that were came from out of the Democratic Party ferment, and really out of the FDR legacy. Nixon put into place. He got the Environmental Protection Agency enacted under his administration. OSHA, on occupational safety and health, was passed during that time. So was the Philadelphia Plan, which was a minority hiring plan for construction purposes with federal contracting. A lot of minority set-aside programs came out of that period. It was interesting when he opened his library. I was out there for that dedication, and he asked me if I'd like to take a tour with him of the library, and we did. Just the two of us went around, and I thought he would take me immediately to the foreign policy section, and instead he went to the domestic and said, I'm really proud of a lot of this. At the time, he didn't seem to care very much about domestic policy. He only seemed to care about foreign policy. But in the long run, I think he felt that was an important part of his legacy. It's important to understand that he was living in a time when the FDR, Lyndon Johnson approach to domestic issues was still very popular in the country, and many people thought that many people looked up to the government. It was seen as an instrument of first resort. It was seen as an instrument that had succeeded not only through the Depression but also through the Second World War. And so the respect level for government was extraordinarily high. It really peaked around the late 60s. But by the time Nixon came in, it was still high. And today, of course, that's been shattered for a whole lot of reasons. The political environment today, even among Democrats, is not as optimistic or as I think is confident about the capacity of government to solve problems. I mean, it was Bill Clinton who told us the era of big government is over. So the overall national politics has changed since then. I think there has been some the embrace of markets, the embrace of leaner government, the sense that too many people are taking advantage. So when we went through welfare reform, which was a bipartisan with Clinton, welfare reform, really said we've got to get people become more independent, and it's not right for them. It's not right for the taxpayer. And I think right now welfare reform, generally speaking, is seen as one of the more successful reform efforts in the last 20 years. It's got some, especially during the hard times we have today, it's got some issues. But so the politics in general has moved, but it has become an item of faith and among Republicans that you get the best results on health care by making people more self-reliant and by relying on market forces. It is not. I think it's unfair to say the Republicans don't like and don't support health care. They do. They think there's a different way to get there. And some elements of it, I must say, I find appealing to me. Among things like the health savings accounts, I think are an idea that deserve to be tried. Giving people incentives to stay well, it seems to me to be consistent with public health policy, a sound public health policy. I don't know how we're going to pay for a lot of these programs we now have, and nobody wants to grasp the difficult choices of end of life. But I think it would be appropriate to say the Republicans don't care about health care reform. I do think it's appropriate to say they are less solicitous of people at the lower end of the spectrum than they should be. And I think they're less respectful or less sensitive to how many people are hurting and how many people really are denied opportunities in life because they can't get decent quality health care. Please.
Hi, my name is Roy Wade.
He did get a terrific introduction of you just before you came.
Oh, good. Thank you.
So one of my questions is, I had an opportunity to actually shadow in Washington, D.C. Recently and sort of see.
You shadowed somebody?
Yeah, shadow someone in HHS and see how, decisions are made and how the government works.
And where was this person?
This was in the Executive Office of Health and Human Services.
Uh-huh.
And one of my questions that I wanted to ask you was that decisions, often things that affect health in particular, but a realm of different things, are sort of a mixture of different components. So if you think about poor health or obesity, things that might affect that are transportation and housing and access to food. But it's, you see very quickly that decisions are made sort of, by agency and not sort of grouped together. And where you have an individual such as the president who is making broad-ranging decisions, how have you seen that they've gone about sort of getting the different opinions and of different individuals from different departments, or does that even exist? Are those decisions made?
Well, the notion is that the White House staff, the domestic policy component of the White House staff, which has gone up and down in size, is supposed to do the coordination, just as the National Security Council staff coordinates the making of foreign policy and ensures that the president gets the benefit of the views of all primary players. And that's what's supposed to happen on the domestic side. I must say that because the foreign policy coordination is something which became urgent after the Second World War, and they developed an apparatus for that and a staff and some strong traditions. I think that works much better in general than it works on domestic policy. There are sort of assigned, there's traditions encrusted now which ensure that before foreign policy decisions are made, there are meetings of the principals, as they're called, and a principals meeting would be the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, CIA, head of the Joint Chiefs, National Security Advisor, and 2 or 3 others. And I was part of the principals group for a while in the national security during the Clinton administration. And while I had objected to some aspects of it, I thought it was too tactical. But I was nevertheless impressed by the degree to which it was organized, and the president did get the benefit of a variety of views. And there were subgroups. There was the deputies. I mean, there was the principals group, and then there was a deputies group, and there was a sub-deputies group, and they met regularly, and they brought everything together. And the national security advisor, that principal job of the national security advisor, whether man or woman, is to ensure that the president gets a range and full range of views. And as I say, I think because it's also it has this long tradition, and it attracts some high-powered people. There are a number of, by the way, graduates of Harvard in the national security apparatus. This same thing is supposed to be mirrored over the domestic side, but I have found that it doesn't work as well on the domestic side. It's a little more haphazard, frankly.
Why is that?
In part because it's so sprawling. In part because there are different things. There are different parts of it that have grown up over time. The Council of Economic Advisors was set up by statute in the post-war period in the late 40s, and ever since then there's been sort of a chief economic advisor who's an economist working with a small team of often very, very good a junior economist or a mid-level economist. And it's a place you go as an economist. If you're interested in building your career as a public intellectual, as an economist, you don't want to be strictly in the academy. Going and spending a year or 2 at the CEA, as it's called, is a very, very good experience. I first got to know Larry Summers in the Reagan administration. I was working for Reagan in the White House West Wing, and he was working as an economist, as a junior economist for the CEA. And he didn't share any of Reagan's views, but it was regarded as a place you could go work, even though you didn't. He was much more liberal than Reagan was. Although he's also a free market guy. But they have a very important role in providing coming from economic theory and economic forecasting to the president. That's a central role that's played. Well, but there you've got the Treasury Department, and you've got a lot of other players, Commerce Department, who are also interested in economic policy. So what presidents have learned that they've got to put together an economic coordinating team. That's the job, and coordinating that team was the job that Larry Summers first had going into this administration. It was the job Bob Rubin had in the early part of the Clinton administration. He came out of Goldman Sachs. That's a very, very important job, but it's about economic policy. What about civil rights policy? What about education policy? What about, there are all these other issues that are vitally important that are not simply economic in nature. So where do you put all that? Well, it's been hard to figure out that. And what the President Obama's wound up with is he's got his economic policy team, but then he has an environmental czar. He has environment and energy. He's got another, Melody Barnes heads up the domestic issues that are not economic. But then she gets put a little bit down the totem pole because she's not economic. Then they brought in the healthcare czar and Nancy DeMint-DeParle. And they've got these various pockets of power and responsibility that don't always talk to each other. And it becomes really, really hard for the president to do that. Now, there's an additional layer about this, and that is, where do the political people fit in? Where do the people who come in out of politics and out of the campaigns who are the keeper of the flame, the promises and the keeper of your political fortunes, where do they fit in? Well, it varies by administration. I'm of the view that in the Clinton administration, the policy people tended to be the inner circle. And the political people tended to be one circle out. In fact, a lot of the major political people didn't even work in the White House. James Carville didn't work in the White House. His chief pollster didn't work in the White House. They came in for meetings, but they maintained private lives. Whereas in the Obama administration, in the first term, I think the political people actually were the inner circle. It was the Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod and Gibbs and Valerie Jarrett and one or two others who were very, very tight with him. And a lot of the policy advice had to go through those filters because the policy people tended to be one circle out. And when he came down to decision making, yes, he would meet with his policy people, but before he made his final decisions, he met with his political people. And I think that I think that's changing. And one of the things I thought he did a good job was bringing in Bill Daley. Although Bill Daley comes from Chicago, he's not part of the tight little inner circle that the president had, and I think that's opened it up some. My very firm impression about how to run a White House is you got to bring some of your campaign people. They know you, they know what you promised, they know who your friends are, they've got to look after your political fortunes. I mean, this is a political job after all. But you need some people who are not part of your inner circle, who know something about policy and know something about politics. And one of the reasons that Reagan was more successful was he doesn't depend entirely on his California team. He brought Californians with him, but he brought in Jim Baker, who was most assuredly not one of the Californians and was regarded as way too moderate by many on the right, way too wet, as in the Margaret Thatcher terms. And yet, when we had the 100th anniversary of Reagan's birthday 2 weeks ago, who was it they had as the chief speaker that Nancy chose as chief speaker was Jim Baker. It was quite striking. So, and Obama believes me, because he's been reading Lou Cannon on Reagan, knows all about Jim Baker, and he knows all about the value that having an outside player do. And Baker was understood policy as well as politics. Joe Califano was a supremely important player. I'll just finish here on Lyndon Johnson, and as a domestic policy coordinator. He's really smart. I didn't know him well, but he came in once to see Clinton, and I was in that meeting with Clinton with a small group of us. And in an hour, I was floored by how good Joe Califano was. He was really good. It's rare you meet. He was sort of impressed me like Kissinger. I mean, this guy was very, very smart, but he was able to be very concise with the president and give him a sense of, okay, here's what I believe, but you ought to know these are other points on the spectrum. You ought to understand that there are different ways to look at this.
I have the unfortunate task of having to end this on time. David, thank you extremely.
Well, thank you. Very much. Thank you. This is your class.
No, actually, this is being webcast around the school. So this is a portion of your class? Not of the class, of the school. So we invite the school, but like the draft, we have sort of a random selection who make it in the
Use 2 bowls and 2 buns.
Yes, that's times we'll remember. Thank you
good.
again.
Thanks so much.
Much.
Thank you. I hope that was it.